In 2011, a FUNAI field worker reached a stretch of Mato Grosso forest and filmed something. The footage was not released to the public until 2013, and when it was, it generated headlines around the world. The captions called them the last, the uncontacted, a people frozen in time, living exactly as their ancestors had lived, untouched by the modern world, hidden by the forest for centuries. The figures in the footage move through the trees, talking among themselves, unaware at first that they are being watched. When one of them discovers the camera, there is a moment of recognition, not of what the camera is, but of danger, and they move away quickly. That moment was not what the captions described. The captions described a timeless people in a timeless place. What the camera had actually recorded was a specific group of people responding to a threat in a specific forest, in a specific year, carrying a specific history. That distinction matters more than anything the captions acknowledged. What the historical record also shows, and what those captions did not mention, is that when the Kawahiva's territory is placed against the documented geography of the rubber extraction zone active in that region between 1890 and 1912, the correspondence is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The forest those figures moved through had been legally granted to rubber interests by Brazilian federal land commissions before any of those figures were born. That alignment does not appear in the news coverage. It does not appear in the advocacy campaigns. It has never appeared in a headline. And that absence is not accidental. The story we have been given about the Amazon's last isolated tribes is that they are remnants of the ancient world. Peoples who chose the forest over modernity, whose isolation is the product of millennia of undisturbed custom. That story is everywhere. It is in United Nations declarations protecting indigenous peoples. It is in Brazilian federal law. It is in every photo essay that has ever used the phrase untouched by civilization. It is emotionally coherent, politically useful, and built on a foundation that does not hold. The word uncontacted does enormous work in that foundation. It implies voluntary separation from the beginning of time. It suggests that wherever these people are, they chose to be there, and they chose it long before the modern world arrived to make choosing necessary. The story that version never tells is this. The isolation was not always ancient. In many cases it was recent. It was not chosen at the beginning of time. It was chosen in a specific decade, in response to a specific violence, and the records that would make that visible were largely buried before 1908. Roger Casement was a British consul general, based in Rio de Janeiro. In 1910 and 1911, he led an investigation for the British Foreign Office into what was happening in the Putumayo River Basin, a region straddling what is now Peru and Colombia, managed at the time by a company called the Peruvian Amazon Company, controlled by the rubber baron Julio Cesar Arana. The report Casement produced was submitted to the Foreign Secretary in January 1911, and the British government formally published it in July 1912. It was methodical and devastating. Casement had spoken to survivors. He had collected 30 depositions from the company's Barbadian employees, British subjects, which gave him legal standing to interview them. And what those depositions described was a system of forced labour, debt bondage, mutilation, and killing that had been operating openly for years. Among the details those testimonies captured were rubber quotas enforced through flogging, confinement in stocks for workers who failed to meet production targets, and killings carried out not in secret, but as administrative procedure, visible enough that employees could describe them in precise detail, invisible enough that they had continued for years before any outside authority registered them as crimes. His investigation documented what had happened to the indigenous population of the Putumayo Basin. From an estimated 50,000 people in 1906, the number had fallen to no more than 10,000 by the time he arrived. The groups recorded at the beginning of the boom were not, in any significant number, the groups he found when he arrived. Some had been killed, some had been driven out, some had simply ceased to appear in any record at all. Those same territories are classified today as uncontacted zones. That is the first fracture in the official story, and it has a date. The isolation did not begin in the distant past. The isolation timeline matches the violence timeline almost perfectly. These people did not remain uncontacted. They became uncontacted. There is a difference. The difference is what was done to them. And when the official story does not ask what was done, It is often because the asking would require the story to explain what was built on the answer. Among the administrative records produced by the Casa Arana operation, some of which survive in Peruvian archives, are labour accounting documents listing indigenous workers by tribal affiliation, tracking rubber output and discipline infractions. In one such document, a final column appears blank against most entries. What that column recorded is not labelled. A surviving account from a former company employee, collected during the investigations of that era, identified such blanks as the accounting for those who'd been removed, killed, fled, or simply stopped appearing. The record treated the blank column as a completion of the file. The person had been processed. The matter was closed. That kind of document is the physical logic of this story. Return to it each time the meaning shifts, because the meaning keeps shifting. What the concession maps make visible is something even more structurally important than the individual violence Casement catalogued. Between 1880 and 1907, the governments of Brazil and Peru issued a series of land grants to rubber interests that described enormous stretches of Amazon forest as vacant. In Brazilian legal terminology, terras devolutas, devolved or unclaimed land that the state held in trust and could grant to private interests. The phrase appears in federal documents throughout the 1890s as an administrative routine. It was not understood as violence because it was framed as bureaucratic management. But what the phrase required, the legal and functional thing it required, was the declaration that no one was living in those territories who held recognized standing. The land could not be vacant if it was inhabited, so the inhabitants were made, on paper, absent. That legal fiction is how property becomes possible. It is also how atrocity becomes legible as transaction, and it is why the maps that preceded the rubber boom's worst years show inhabited territories, while the maps drawn afterwards show empty forest. This is not metaphor. The administrative infrastructure of the rubber boom required the prior legal erasure of existing populations. The story of untouched primordial wilderness required the prior fiction of unpeopled land. The official version of what the Amazon was, ancient, empty, waiting, was not accidental. It was a condition of property transfer. This is where the story stops being about one tribe in a clearing and starts being about a system. Across the western Amazon, a significant number of tribal groups documented by missionaries, explorers, and company employees before 1900 had disappeared from those same documentary sources by 1912. Not all were destroyed. Some were absorbed into rubber labour and renamed. Some were driven far enough inland that they left the operational zone entirely. The records do not always specify, but the pattern is consistent enough that the variation in outcome matters less than the consistency of the mechanism. By the end of the rubber boom's most violent phase, a significant portion of the Amazon's mapped indigenous population had been made, in some functional administrative sense, invisible. Some of those people walked into the forest and did not come back. That choice, if it can be called that, was not primitivism. It was not a preference for an older way of life over a newer one. It was a survival calculation made by people who had watched what happened when they remained visible. The deep forest withdrawal that the outside world romanticizes as ancient isolation was, in many cases, a rational and desperate response to contact with the rubber economy. These people were not hiding their history, they were hiding from ours. The concept that researchers have slowly, carefully begun articulating is sometimes called strategic invisibility. It describes the pattern of rapid, deliberate retreat from known contact zones, retreat that was deep enough and sustained, enough that it eventually outlasted the immediate threat and became the only identity the outside world recorded for those who survived. By the time the rubber economy collapsed after 1912, the withdrawal had already been going on long enough that the groups most successful at it had become, in every external record available, absent. No missionary had visited, no company employee had listed them, no government survey had placed them. They had vanished from the administrative world so completely that when Brazilian anthropologists and federal officials began constructing an understanding of isolated peoples in the mid-20th century, they found groups whose invisibility looked ancient even when it was only decades old. The classification system that would later be built to protect them was built on that inherited assumption, and that assumption was never interrogated for what it might be protecting instead. Now look again at that administrative record. The tribal names in the left column, the rubber output recorded against each name, the discipline entries, the blank column at the far right, the accounting for those who had been removed. The people whose names appear in that kind of document were not ancient. They were contemporary, men and women living inside an industrial extraction system, their labour recorded in ink, their fate marked by the presence or absence of an entry in a space that the company left deliberately vague. Some were killed, some fled, some disappeared entirely from every record that followed. The question the evidence now demands is not just what happened to those specific people. The question is why the official classification system that governs how we understand their descendants was built in a way that makes that question essentially unanswerable. Placed against the historical record of the rubber extraction zone active in that region between 1890 and 1912, the Kawahiva's territory shows a geographic correspondence that the official framing has never been asked to explain. The territory becomes, under the classification system, a permanent present. The past becomes inaccessible, not because the records have all been destroyed, but because the legal structure around the land was built in a way that does not require the past to be examined. The evidence buried before 1908 did not simply disappear into the forest. It was processed, it was reclassified, and something was built over it that looks from a distance like protection. The blank column, the names listed, the date at the top. The word uncontacted does not mean what most people think it means. It sounds like a description of the past, of a people who have never encountered the outside world, who have lived since the beginning in voluntary primordial separation. That is how it is used in journalism. That is how it appears in the advocacy materials and the conservation campaigns and the human interest photographs. But in Brazilian federal law, uncontacted is not a historical description. It is a legal category. And legal categories have functions that their names do not always reveal. Under the framework FUNAI operates within, consolidated most completely in the 1988 Brazilian Constitution's indigenous land provisions, which are among the most progressive in the world, the uncontacted designation triggers a set of exclusions. No outside party may enter the territory without FUNAI authorization. No resource extraction can legally proceed. No land title may be claimed by private interest within the protected zone. These are genuine protections, and they have saved lives. The people they surround would be in immediate danger without them. That is not in question. What is in question is what else the designation does, because the same legal architecture that keeps loggers and missionaries and mining interests out also keeps historians in. The territory becomes legally frozen at the moment of classification. The administrative record of what the territory contained before that classification, who lived there, how many, under what conditions, with what history of contact or violence or withdrawal, is not required for the designation to function. The protection is prospective. The history remains unexamined. And in a territory whose recent past included documented atrocity, that gap is not neutral. This is where the story has to take a step back. Because the institutional structure that produced the uncontacted designation did not begin in 1988. It began in 1910, and it began with a specific political problem. The Serviço de Proteção aos Índios, the Indian Protection Service, the SPUI, was founded in Brazil in 1910. The timing matters. The first public international accusations of indigenous genocide in Brazil had been raised at the Congress of Americanists in Vienna in 1908. Casement's Putumayo investigation was producing reports that circulated across diplomatic channels and in the British press. International attention to Amazonian violence was, briefly, at a peak. The founding of the SPI was presented domestically and internationally as Brazil's institutional response, evidence that the state recognized the harm being done and intended to address it. The official story of the SPY is that it was a humanitarian intervention, a protective framework built at the moment the rub of violence was becoming visible. The founding documents tell a different story. The SPI's full original name was the Serviço de Proteção aos Índios e Localização de Trabalhadores Nacionais, the Service for the Protection of Indians and the Settlement of National Workers. Protection was one stated function. The other was the placement of indigenous groups into agricultural labour colonies under state supervision. The protection mechanism was simultaneously an integration mechanism, the integration mechanism was simultaneously an assimilation mechanism, and the assimilation mechanism was simultaneously an erasure mechanism. Because the SPI records from its first 3 decades of operation show a consistent pattern. Once a tribal group was contacted, processed, and placed under SPI administration, its members were renamed, given Portuguese surnames, registered as Brazilian citizens, their former tribal identities documented as functionally closed in the administrative file. Not metaphorically erased, bureaucratically erased. The file was closed. The practical consequence of this is large enough that it needs to be stated plainly. The SP's records between 1910 and 1940 document the administrative closure of dozens of tribal identities across the Amazon basin. Groups with prior missionary documentation, prior appearance in company labour records, prior geographic notation on explorers' maps. These groups were contacted, processed, renamed, and reclassified. After reclassification, they no longer existed as tribal entities in any federal record. They existed as Brazilian citizens of indigenous origin, absorbed into rural labour in the colony structure. The SPI file would be marked settled. The process had a rhythm, and the rhythm had an endpoint, and the endpoint always looked the same. The groups that had retreated before 1908, deep enough, fast enough, far enough, escaped this particular erasure. Their survival in isolation was not the outcome of a long-planned strategy. It was the outcome of having moved when moving was still possible. And their isolation became, by default, the only identity they retained in the record. There was no tribal file open for them, because they had never been processed. There was no SPI documentation, because no SPI agent had reached them. The absence of a file became the evidence of their timelessness. But the absence was not ancient, it was recent. And it was the product of a system that had closed the files on everyone else. Now consider who benefited from that particular arrangement. The rubber economy collapsed after 1912. The immediate cause was market competition. British rubber plantations in Southeast Asia, established from seeds smuggled out of the Amazon in 1876, had been producing at a scale and cost that made Amazonian extraction unviable almost overnight. The companies contracted, then folded. The Peruvian Amazon Company was wound up in a London court in March 1913. The operational infrastructure that had driven the Putumayo violence, the labour systems, the territorial concessions, the disciplinary machinery, was simply abandoned. The rubber interests left. The violence ceased to be economically necessary, but the records of what had happened between 1880 and 1912 did not dissolve with the companies. Watch the sequence. The Peruvian Amazon Company dissolved. 1913. Roger Casement was arrested in April 1916, not for his Amazon work but for his role in the Irish independence movement, and executed on August 3rd of that year. With Casement gone, his Amazon report lost its primary institutional advocate. The British Parliamentary Committee that had examined the Putumayo case in 1913 had already published its findings and dispersed. The British Foreign Office, which had received and published the report, had begun treating it as a closed matter. International attention had shifted to a world war. The Brazilian government, through the SPY, absorbed whatever documentation existed on indigenous populations within its borders and proceeded to reclassify it. Brazilian federal land records produced in the years following the rubber collapse mapped large sections of the western Amazon without reference to the populations whose removal or displacement the boom had required. The land did not record what had been done to make it legible. The institutions that produced the first generation of systematic scientific literature on Amazonian peoples operated in the years immediately following the rubber collapse, inside a commercial and governmental world that had no institutional interest in revisiting what the rubber economy had done to the peoples those researchers were studying. The foundational framework they developed described the Amazon's indigenous populations as ancient, culturally static, and separated from history by the density of the forest itself. It was serious academic work. It was produced inside a specific set of historical circumstances, and it was a framework that made the history of the rubber boom difficult to see as a history of those same populations. The romance of the last tribe did not develop in a vacuum. Return now to the footage from 2011, the figures moving through the trees, the moment of recognition and retreat, the captions calling them the last and the uncontacted and the ancient. That footage was real. Those people are real. The threat they face from illegal logging and land invasion is real, ongoing, and serious. None of that is in question. But what the camera was actually capturing was not a window into the ancient past. It was the living result of a specific historical event. A mass withdrawal triggered by documented violence, preserved across generations by the practical impossibility of return, and then enshrined in law by a classification system whose administrative logic made the past inaccessible. missionary correspondence from the Jura River region in the years around 1907 and 1908, the kind of record that survives in Brazilian and Peruvian ecclesiastical archives, rarely digitized and rarely cited, contains accounts of tribal groups that retreated abruptly following raids by rubber camp operators. In some of these accounts, the linguistic and geographic descriptions correspond to territories FUNAI now classifies as uncontacted. The correspondence was filed, passed on to no one, and in most cases has never been systematically cross-referenced against the classification records that came decades later. One document is not definitive, but one document is rarely what makes a pattern. The pattern is made by the absence of anyone looking for the connection in the first place. What FUNAI's own field documentation has noted, and this matters, is that the territories of several uncontacted groups contain archaeological evidence of significantly larger former populations, cleared land that predates the current tree cover, old garden plots recognisable from aerial survey, ceramic fragments, fire scars, the physical infrastructure of communities that were not small, not transient, and not isolated in the way that isolation is usually described. The archaeology says many more people lived here, and they had not always lived this way. The official narrative says they have always been few, always been remote, always been separate. These two things cannot both be true. The simplest version of what the evidence shows is this: the Amazon's isolated peoples are not evidence of an untouched world. They are evidence of a rupture, a period of extraction violence so severe and so thoroughly obscured in its aftermath that the survivors became, by administrative default, proof of their own erasure. The official story required the Amazon to be primordial. The rubber economy had required it to be legally empty. The post-colonial state required it to be protected, and each of these requirements in sequence converged on the same outcome. The history of what actually happened in those territories between 1880 and 1912 was never the story that anyone with institutional power needed to be told. The tribes were not the last because they had always been apart. They were the last because everyone else had been processed, renamed, absorbed, or killed, and the institutional frameworks built in the aftermath had no functional interest in distinguishing between those outcomes. Come back now to that blank column in the administrative record, the tribal names on the left, the rubber output, the discipline entries, the blank space at the far right, the accounting for those who had been removed. The people whose names appear in that kind of record were not ancient. They were contemporary, men and women living inside an industrial system, their labour tracked in ink, their fate marked by presence or absence in a space the company left deliberately vague. Some were killed, some were absorbed and renamed and placed into agricultural colonies, and had their tribal affiliation closed in a file that was subsequently archived and forgotten. Some fled, far enough, fast enough, and their descendants are what FUNAI now films from a distance and calls uncontacted. The tribe is not hiding centuries of their own history. They are the evidence of what was done to that history, and they are the evidence of what was done, in the decades that followed, to make sure no one would think to ask. The camera is still running, the figures in the trees are still moving away. Somewhere in a Peruvian archive, the labour records still have blank columns at their far right edge. Somewhere in an ecclesiastical collection in Brazil, missionary correspondence still sits filed under catalogue numbers that have never been cross-referenced against what FUNAI later recorded as timeless. The question those documents together produce is not a comfortable one. It is not about what the tribes have been hiding, it is about what was hidden from us, and by what means, and for whose use, and how much of that design is still, quietly, in place.